So how do you know what to do first? Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Tuesday, busy clinic day today. Mentorship calls before then. So lots of things to do. We're going to dive right into today's Q&A. Today's Q&A was with Kyle. I had a chance to talk to Kyle over the weekend, and he asked some really, really good questions that I think are going to be helpful for a lot of people in regards to how do we sequence activities once we've identified what our clients' needs are. What do we prioritize? And then we got into a little bit of programming as to how we execute these things based on key performance indicators. So again, a very, very useful call. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, you can do so by just asking. So you go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put 15-minute consult in the subject line so I don't delete it, and then throw me a question in the email, and we'll get that arranged at our earliest mutual convenience. Okay, everybody have an outstanding Tuesday. We will be back tomorrow with another Q&A. I'll see you. Cool. Okay, Kyle, clock is running. What can I do for you, young man?
All right. So my question was about kind of your process for selecting exercises. So within your model, you'll look at, from my understanding, you'll look at a lot of these different range of motions and kind of decipher what movement options these people have available.
Right.
And then when you're in the process of actually choosing that exercise, if you were to want to increase someone's hip internal rotation, for example,
right.
Okay, I've decided already, I've gone through the process of knowing that this is my move. Now let's pick something that's going to accomplish that task.
Right.
There are multiple moves that could probably accomplish that task. How are we going about trying to get the best one for this specific individual? So some of the other variables that I've contemplated are infrasternal angle presentation, things like training age, and just there are other table tests and how those are going to play into it. But I'm really interested in like all the variables you factor in and kind of deciding like, yes, this was the right choice for this person.
Okay. So I like the way you're thinking about this, because you're looking at this person as an individual, because everybody presents differently in regards to what their capabilities are. So let me give you a comparison. If I have a 45-year-old accountant that has never played a sport in his life, or I'm working with an NBA basketball player, they're not the same. Even if they had the same measures, I would have to approach this differently. Okay. So but a couple of principles to keep in mind when you're trying to make some decisions as to how to approach this. Okay. If I have a situation where, excuse me, where I've identified the fact that there's an anterior orientation of the pelvis, that's where the pelvis is typically going to go. It would be extremely rare to see somebody in a compensatory strategy that went the other way, right? It just doesn't happen because our center of gravity will go forward. Okay. So if I have somebody that's dealing with an anterior orientation, that has to be addressed. So your exercise selection has to make sure that that is taken care of. If the goal is to restore relative motions, right? So we're talking about movement between the sacrum and the ilium, not the pelvis moving as an entire unit. Okay. That's typically what the problem is that the whole pelvis is compressed together and moving as a single unit. Okay, so that's typically going to be step one when we start to see people that have these superficial strategies that get layered on. So like if I lose ERs and IRs, I know right away I've got that anterior posterior compression. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so I have to do that. I have to do that first. Then it's just a matter of like, do I have enough space? Do I have enough space to create the range of motions that I'm looking for? So if I have lost both ERs and IRs, I need to create that ER space first. Okay, so I have to try to recapture, because that represents the space within which I can actually move. Internal rotation is always superimposed on the field. I call it a field because that's what it is. It's basically a space. The field of external rotation that you move in, okay, internal rotation is superimposed upon that. So it doesn't exist separate from the external rotation. So if I squeeze my external rotations inward, okay, that's the maximum IR that I can produce. If I expand my ERs, now I have much more room to produce the IR. Okay. This is why we see people that when they are compressed, they start to turn their hip sockets and shoulder sockets outward because they're trying to create ER space. Now it's an orientation. So yes, it's external rotation. It is a representation of external rotation, but they haven't expanded the space. They've just turned towards ER, and that allows them to get enough internal rotation down on the ground. So an example of this would be, why do you see powerlifters switch to sumo style deadlifts? Because they can turn their hip sockets out and then they can capture more internal rotation. So the guys that struggle to even get into position in a traditional deadlift, they don't have enough ER space, so they don't have enough IR to even get into the position of a traditional deadlift. So they start moving their legs outward, and now they can find their internal rotation. So from a principle standpoint, what we just said is orientation first, ER field second, and then we can superimpose the IR on top of that. Now, having said that, you can increase internal rotation measures without expanding the IR field, but what you did is you distributed it somewhere else. You just made them IR harder in another place. Okay, so you got to be really, really careful with that, because that can alleviate pain and things like that, but you didn't improve the situation, you just moved it somewhere else. Okay, now, if I have someone that is highly coordinated, right, just based on their physical history, you have somebody that's I'll have people that come in that they teach group exercise classes. It's like, okay, so I know this person's moved in their lifetime. I can use a much more complex activity. I might be able to do something on their feet right away. So for instance, if I'm trying to capture left hip internal rotation on an individual, and they are a chronic exerciser, and they've got a sports history, I can give them a right suitcase carry and I can capture that internal rotation. Because the way that the load interacts with the system as they're walking produces a stronger middle propulsive action on the opposite side, and that gets me my hip internal rotation. But if I have my 45-year-old accountant that's never played a sport in their life and all they do is sit down all day, that's going to be probably too complex. So what I might have to do there, I might have to go as far as to eliminate gravity, do something with them laying down that allows them to reacquire that left hip internal rotation. So here's how you figure this stuff out. You do something and you see what happens, right? And it sounds like a lousy answer, but that's reality, because I don't know, under many circumstances, I just don't know what someone's capabilities are. So I'm making a judgment call based on my experience. So in most cases, like I said, I wouldn't give the suitcase deadlift to the accountant that's never played a sport and doesn't know how to move, because again, his system is going to be defensive under those circumstances, and he's gonna try to prevent motion, right? So I got to put him in a place where I've reduced as many of the forces possible on him to allow him to be successful. So again, I lay him down, I reorient gravity, I take it out of the equation, and then I can teach him some sort of movement vocabulary is what I call it. Is basically, I have to provide him cues so he can start to feel different things that allow him to sense when he is moving, because chances are he doesn't have that, where my athlete or my chronic exerciser that's been exposed to many different things, all I have to do is say, hey, do this, and they immediately know what I mean, right? So there's a little bit of experience that plays into this, and there's a little bit of an understanding of what the probabilities are, and that's what experience provides. It's like think about it. It's like you've worked with 1,000 different people, you get all these different presentations, but then you start to see these things show up that sort of guide your thought process. Whereas if you only saw 10 people, you wouldn't be able to make those same judgments. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense.
It's a very gray answer, but because we're dealing with a very gray situation, because there's so many unknowns. So one of the things that I do as I'm talking to my clients is I just ask them. I say, like, what sports did you play in school? Like, it sounds like conversation to them.
Mhm.
But literally what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out what are their movement capabilities? What have they been exposed to? What will they understand? And then maybe I can speak their language a little bit. So if I had a jujitsu player come in and he's talking about like, I got this hip thing. And then I can go, it's like, oh, when you do that, what you always notice that you kind of hip escape really easily to one side. And then you try to go to the other side and you can't do it. He goes, yeah, it's like, okay, so that's literally what we're talking about. So now I can take his jujitsu and I can make it one of his exercises. And I say, I need you to practice your hip escape to the opposite side. And then that teaches him to create all of these different strategies through the pelvis and through the hip. And so now that helps me select what I want to do for him because it's meaningful to him and it's useful at the same time, but he understands it. Okay. So a lot of this is just kind of relating to the individual and getting an understanding. Now, having said all that, okay, I fail a lot. Okay. Because I always try to hit the home run. If I can give somebody one exercise that addresses 3 different concerns, I will try to do that first. Okay. Again, it takes someone that's more coordinated than somebody that isn't. So like I said, again, I pick on the 45-year-old accountant that's never played a sport because it's kind of easy to do. So under those circumstances, I tend to not give them the most complex of exercises. But if I have an athlete that comes in, it's like, hey, we're going to go in the gym and we're going to mess around with some cable activities. Whereas with the accountant, he's laying on his back or he's laying on his side, or I'm teaching him how to roll, like literally teaching somebody how to roll, because they don't have that capacity based on their physical shape. So does that help you at all?
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. And like I said in the email, like, I figure there's a degree of, there's always going to be a degree of, we're going to try this, we're going to see what happens, and we're going to move forward. That actually brings up another question,
sure,
if you don't mind. So in one of these other talks that you've done that I saw on Instagram, you were talking to someone who had said, for instance, if I want to increase velocity of this baseball pitcher, then I'm going to try to build muscle for him, just in that situation. And your question then was like, well, how do you know that intervention is getting that result and there's not something else going on? So kind of like your process on that, because it's like, if we take someone through a training session and we get the results we want, but if we did multiple things, it's like, well, how do I know that, I'll just give you an example. I worked with a kid who was very narrow ISA, all of his inhalation measures, great. Exhalation measures, non-existent.
Right.
So we did, and also very, very skinny. Yeah. So we did a lot of hypertrophy work, but we also tried to give him that dynamic ISA and increase those exhalation-based measures. So I'm like, as vertical went up, I'm like, this, like he wanted, but I'm like, did he just need some muscle? Or did he need to create those strategies and have access to those strategies in order to get higher? And it's kind of like, how do we decipher these things?
Okay, so this is a great question because it just relates to the training process in general and how we actually execute this thing, right? So, and in fact, I had this exact same conversation yesterday on a podcast. Okay, but it's really important that people understand this. We can't predict what's going to happen. Experience provides us, as I said earlier, the ability to narrow the probabilities as to what may be the influences and what might be the best interventions. And so that's how we initiate. But we have to get to know these people and understand their responses to certain aspects of training. And so again, it's not like you're going to write a 12-week vertical jump program and expect it to work. I don't know that I've ever written a program that I didn't have to change at some point in time because you're constantly adjusting to the individual. And I always talk, you heard me talk about key performance indicators. So there's certain measures that based on your experience and based on the interaction with this individual that that you have to maintain. So for instance, with a baseball pitcher, they need external rotation to demonstrate velocity. There's no question about that. Like if you don't have ERs, you are not going to throw fast. Like you just can't. Mm-hmm. So I want to increase force production on my athletes as much as possible, as long as it doesn't interfere. So let's just say that I'm following this kid and I'm monitoring his external rotations to make sure that they are maintained at all times. Okay. And we put him on the hypertrophy program and he's doing really, really well. Force production goes up. So you said, hey, vertical jump goes up. So obviously we're doing something that is having an impact, right? But he starts to lose external rotation. That's not a good thing. Okay. Maybe up to a point, as long as we're seeing that, and again, we have to use the performance and then we use our key performance indicators that support that performance. Okay. And again, we do this over time. It might take you 2-3 training cycles to figure out which key performance indicator is the most important one. You might not know right away. Mm-hmm. Like I said, you have to get to know, you have to have time to get to know these people. And sometimes this is really hard because sometimes we'll get people, like we'll get our professional athletes in and we'll have maybe 6 to 8 weeks. Like their off seasons are short, right? Yeah. And so we might only have 6 to 8 weeks where we can, work with these guys. And so that gets really hard. Okay. But if you're working with a kid that's developing, you got more time and you can kind of figure these things out as you go. But that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Right? You got to get to know how these people respond. You do an intervention, you make small changes over time. So like when you're updating a training program, each training program should look similar to the previous one with the smallest changes necessary to maintain the progress. And that's kind of how you know what the influence is going to be. And again, we would never do this, but let's just say you gave them 10 exercises on the first exercise program. And then the next one comes around and you give them 10 totally different exercises. How are you going to know?
Yeah.
You're not going to know what was creating the effect, right? So that's why we work in these short intervals. Okay. So we'll call them sprints. We'll do like a 2-week sprint where we're trying to raise something, right? And then we monitor our key performance indicators, and then we do we have some form of embedded test, whether it be like you mentioned vertical jump. You can do that under certain circumstances. Maybe it's how he like baseball is like huge right now. So I got kids that are throwing off the mound for their high school season, right? And so they'll come in and I'll see them every 2 weeks and I'll just say, how'd you throw? Which means that it's like, how'd you throw off the mound? And then, so we'll check their velo, we'll check their spin and all the parameters that we can track for baseball pitchers, right? So we're constantly monitoring those things. And that's how we kind of plug and chug the activities, right? And we tweak them. And then we just get to know the kid over time. So like I get a kid that he's gonna pitch for Northwestern. And I've known him for 4 years. So he walks in and I kind of know what to expect. Right. So he's an easy one to work with. But again, it took me a long time to try to understand him, just like it does with any other athlete. But that's how you do it. You do it based on time, you do it based on your experience. And then you know what? Trial and error is scientific. Mm-hmm. But you make small changes, not huge ones, because when you make these gigantic changes in programming, now you really don't know. You really don't know. And that's your own fault. That like we have to take responsibility for that. It's like when we make a change like that and we don't understand what the change in influence is, that's our fault. But that's why this is hard.
Yeah.
Right? People think this is easy stuff. It's not. You're dealing with humans, complex humans.
Yeah.
Was that helpful?
Yeah, that was super helpful.
Okay.
And just if you don't mind me clarifying real quick,
sure.
That point about like you'll try different things. Or with the pitcher, like, we're moving in the right direction in one indicator, but we're also losing a very important indicator. So are you constantly weighing that option of like, what am I going to get out of this and what could I potentially lose out of this? And kind of like, these are the things I'm going to be constantly pulling from.
Always,
Okay.
always. You have to pay attention. You have to pay attention because that's how you're going to learn over time. And that's, again, we're always playing probabilities. We don't know what the answer is going to be. We can figure it out by looking back. In hindsight, we can figure this stuff out. Okay. That's why that's important too, is to always look back and say, what happened? What could I have done better this time? What did we do wrong this time? That's how you start to narrow the probabilities, but it's always going to be like that. It's always going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay to not know,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're safe. Okay.
Yep.
All right, brother. I got to go to another call. So it was good to meet you. And then, hey, man, get on one of the coaches and coffee calls, man.
Yeah, hell yeah. Well, you guys are you're 2 hours ahead of me, so I've been looking at that. I'm like 4 a.m. That's tough.
I understand. Have a great weekend, man.
Appreciate it.